Hello, APBIO. In this class, I'm going to talk about Chapter 51, which is a chapter on animal behavior. And we're specifically going to talk about behavioral ecology. So we're here in your notes. For some blocks, we actually got through this, but I think in all blocks, we defined the field of study of behavioral ecology is the study of the evolutionary basis of animal behavior due to ecological pressures. So those are things that are pushing allele frequencies in a particular direction in a particular environment. And in this particular case, the allele frequencies are shifting so that they're shaping animal behaviors. Now, behavioral ecologists and ethologists will ask 4 questions when they're looking at animal behavior, and specifically behavioral ecologists. They're going to ask what the stimulus is, and then what the resulting behavior is. And then because they're looking at the evolutionary basis of that, they're going to look at what the selective advantage of a particular behavior is, whether an animal migrates, or whether an animal buries itself in the mud, whether an animal runs away in a certain particular pattern, whether an animal eats for a particular time and or what distance an animal will flee. They'll freeze for a certain period of time, and then how close can you get without them running away, and then the evolutionary significance of that. I think I talked about in all blocks the 2 basic types of behaviors. We have inborn behaviors and learned behaviors. Those come together to form complex behaviors. Oops, sorry. And then just to clarify what adaptive behaviors are, and that's sort of what we're focusing on, the types of behaviors that are acted on by natural selection. So those behaviors that are genetically controlled will continue to more and more closely match a particular environment. So it's because the behavior provides a selective advantage in a particular environment, just like we saw with physical traits before when we were talking about evolution. So it's sort of a interesting way of thinking about behaviors. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk a little bit more about the 2 basic types of behaviors. So we're here and we're thinking about these 2 different basic types, innate behaviors, learned behaviors, and then we'll look at the 3rd type that's formed when they come together. So down this side of your notes, it's all different types of inborn behaviors. And then down this side of your notes, it's all different types of learned behavior. So one type of an inborn behavior are just movement behaviors. And there are movement behaviors. I know we're talking about animal behavior, but there are movement behaviors in plants as well, so we might as well talk about them both at the same time. The term taxis refers to the directional movement of animals in response to a stimulus, and tropism refers to the directional response of plants in response to a particular stimulus. They're both in response to a particular stimulus. Now, we talk about positive and negative in terms of whether or not an organism is going to move towards something or away. So we talked about it when we talked about plant responses. We talked about positive phototropism. So that's when plants move toward the light. But there's also positive phototaxis, and it's the same idea. It's just that animals are moving toward the light. So phototaxis, positive phototaxis would be directional movement toward light, or negative chemotaxis would be directional movement away from some type of a substance, chemical substance in the environment. So we use taxis to refer to, I guess it's both animals and single-celled organisms as well. Tropism is specific to plants. Now we also have non-directional movement in response to a stimulus. So an organism will just move, but not in any particular direction, and we call that kinesis. Those are both inborn or innate behaviors. We also have what are a movement behavior called reflexes, and reflexes are just an automatic reaction to something. And the interesting thing about reflexes, I don't know if you should recall that we talked about this during the nervous system in Unit 4, how reflexes are actually, a reflex arc is the pathway from the sensory neuron. Here we have a sensory neuron. Let's say this is in your finger. And then this sensory neuron receives the pinprick. The information is actually comes to your central nervous system like it always is, but it's not, it's processed in the spinal cord as opposed to all the way in your brain. And then it issues the command, the central nervous system issues the command, and then the motor neuron, or we call that, I don't know if you recall, the efferent neuron. So this is an afferent neuron, the sensory neuron. And then the efferent neuron is the neuron that's coming from exiting the central nervous system. That's bringing the information to the muscle cell. The muscle cell is called the effector cell. And this the cell that does the thing, that responds to the stimulus, is called the effector cell. Just a little review from our nervous system. In any case, a reflex is an inborn or automatic reaction. Other automatic or inborn reactions, something called a fixed action pattern. And a fixed action pattern is an inborn series of behaviors or a sequence of behaviors that's unchangeable, and it continues to completion once it's initiated. You can watch a fixed action pattern with a goose in this video right here, but it's just an inborn series of behaviors that a classic example is a goose putting an egg back in the nest. And it can be tested by, once the stimulus is taken away, if it's taken away during the series of behaviors or actions that the organism is going to carry out during the pattern, it will continue even though the stimulus is removed until it's completed. Some people say that yawning in humans is a fixed action pattern. It's a little, maybe not the great example. We don't really have fixed action patterns in humans. But once you start to yawn, you know how it's hard to stop yawning. And the stimulus is often someone else yawning that makes you yawn. Like even now that you're thinking about yawning, you're probably going to yawn. So the stimulus, and then once you start, you can't stop. Anyway, not a great example. Humans don't really have fixed action patterns, but that's a discussion for another time. Anyway, okay, so those are all innate behaviors. So we have movement behaviors that are innate, inborn. Reflex is innate or an inborn behavior, and then a fixed action pattern is an inborn or innate behavior. Now, over on the learned side, experience-based learning, the most basic form of learning is what we call habituation. And what happens in habituation is, there's following a period of time of exposure to something, an organism is going to stop responding to a stimulus. So, you know, you're in a waiting room and you're in the dentist office or the doctor's office, and there's like a 4-year-old that's just tapping, tap, 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 tap on the poor fish tank, and the fish don't even care. That's habituation. The fish don't even notice it anymore, because they know that at first they responded maybe by trying to run away or swim away. But after it happened for a period of time, they realized it was meaningless, quote unquote meaningless. They were safe, and that they stopped responding to it. Another example of learned, which is relatively basic, is conditioning. So conditioning is where there's some type of association between some type of action and a reward. So, for example, conditioning is when you think about the smell of chocolate chip cookies and you salivate. You're salivating because you're thinking about eating them, and you salivate before you eat something. You may not even get to eat the yummy, delicious, melty chocolate chip cookies, but you're still salivating. So that's a conditioning behavior. You've tasted the cookies before, so you know that they're delish, and you're anticipating that. That's called conditioning. Now, something called reinforcement is used when trying. We use it when we're training animals sometimes, or people as well, But there's some type of an association with a desired action with a reward, and the reward really has nothing to do with the action. So it's something like when a dog, when you say, shake my hand, and the dog puts his paw up, and then you give it a treat. So that's called reinforcement, and it reinforces particular behavior. So those are learned behaviors. Another type of learned behavior is something called imprinting, and you can watch as a kind of a cute video here of what imprinting is. It's a it's a really rapid learning that takes place in a very brief period of time. That brief period of time is called the critical period, and it results in a long-lasting response. We see it in ducks. They'll imprint on something they think is their mom, and then they'll follow it around. Take a minute to watch this video, and you can see what imprinting is. And that is a learned behavior. Now, the third type of behavior, which I keep saying there's only two, is a complex behavior, which is just a combination of learned and innate. And we talked about foraging behaviors in class on Friday. Other learned behaviors are things like mating behaviors. And mating behaviors refer to the fact that mating and mate choice impacts reproductive success. So it's a behavior that's selected, can be selected for or against. So the appropriate mating behavior, it can be a selective advantage. If you're doing the wrong dance, the ladies are not going to be interested. And mating behaviors can include a whole bunch of different things. Like they can include looking for or attracting a mate. They can include choosing a mate, competing for a mate, and also they're caring, sort of like the female duties and the male duties of caring for the offspring. So those are all mating behaviors. And there are things like mating dances. And there's plenty, like, for example, I think we watched a blue-footed booby dance when we were looking at sexual selection. So there's many different types of organisms will have some type of a display. So things like the number and the frequency of flashes for fireflies is a mating behavior. And if you have the right flashity flash, flash, flash pattern, then it's going to attract a mate. And if you don't, it won't attract a mate. And actually results in reproductive isolation and speciation in fireflies. That's why one of the reasons that there's different species of fireflies. In any case, another interesting behavior that's a complex behavior, a combination of both learned, experience-based, and inborn behaviors is migration. And that's just regular long-distance change in location. It's a response to specific stimuli in the environment, things like temperature and degree day units and the length of the day. Sort of folded into the idea of migration is create another sort of timing. This is with respect to seasons. This is with respect to the 24-hour clock. So we also have internal mechanisms in the nervous system and that are responding to the diurnal pattern of the sun. But that actually it's just an internal chemical signaling process that results in a 24-hour rhythm of many organisms. And then the final sort of most complex form of learning is communication. The most complex form of behaviors is communication. And it's just the transmission and reception of signals. Many organisms do it. It's a symbolic behavior. That's what communication is. And it can be something that you can see, it can be something you can hear, it can be some type of a chemical, it can be touching, but those are all forms of communication. If we think about chemicals, those are things like pheromones, which are just chemical substances that are used for communication between organisms as opposed to hormones that are within an organism. But these four things, including foraging behavior that we talked about in class, are all complex behavior. So mating behavior, migration, communication, as well as foraging behavior are all complex forms of behavior. They have both learned and innate components. Okay, that's it for animal behavior. I hope that was helpful. I'll see you on Monday.